Hello, I'm David DeCosmo. Welcome to ECTV Live. I'm joined by my co-host, Rusty Fender. Welcome, Rusty.
Good to see you, Dave.
The haunts of October.
This is the big month.
It's Halloween time, and we think about the ghosts and the goblins. But in Luzerne County, they found a way to combine the ghosts and the goblins with a good dose of history.
Luzerne County would.
Yeah, Mark
No doubt about
Rossetti.
it.
Mark Rossetti is with us with the Luzerne County Historical
Hi, Mark.
Society.
Hi.
Mark, welcome back.
Thanks for having me, gentlemen.
Actually, you've got a couple Halloween-related events coming up. And the first is not the Ghost Walk, but rather another thing you're doing.
Well, no, actually, the Ghost Walk will be first. The Ghost Walk is going to be this weekend.
Okay.
This Friday and Saturday. We originally were going to do 2 tours, one Friday, one Saturday. They sold out in something like 96 hours or something like that. So then we added 2 more, and those 2 sold out. So then Dr. Lewis, who does the main focus of the tour, who does the
Bill
tour.
Lewis, who has been with us on the program for, I believe, our July 4th program.
Yes. He said, well, we'll do 2 more, so we added a third each day, 6 total, and those aren't sold out yet, but they are, tickets are selling pretty quickly.
Going quickly, yeah. Well, I want to talk about the Ghost Walks, and then we'll get into your other event. I had them in reverse order, I suppose. I think it's neat that you can combine a good dose of history with a little bit of fun in this way. And I've gone on the Ghost Walk a few years back. And it was neat. It was really neat because there are some great stories. And since you've got to see some of the buildings involved, I don't hesitate in having you tell the stories now because they'll still come because we've got to see the buildings. So I want you to share a few of those with us. But first of all, tell us how the whole thing got started.
And the route, too.
Well, the route goes through downtown. We start and finish at our museum building. It's about 2 miles, 2 hours by the time it's all said and done. You go down Franklin Street, around Public Square, up to City Hall, then you go back down Market, down River, then you cut through the Wilkes University campus and end up back on Franklin Street. So it's a little oblong, but you end up...
So it's along the River Common there for a point.
Correct. Yes.
And it's a casual walk.
It is, yes. It's a stroll. We wait for everybody. We say around 2 hours. Sometimes it's a little quicker. Sometimes it's a little longer.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm salaried, so it doesn't matter to me. However long it takes, it takes. And what had happened was a few years ago when Bill Lewis was still on our board, he started doing research because he went to Wilkes for one of his many, many degrees that he has, and he heard many ghost stories on campus. So he started doing research into some of these, and basically the same stories have been told from class after class after class after class. And then when you looked at the buildings themselves, some kind of weird stuff happened. And basically everything on the tour is verified. It's all true. The closest thing that wouldn't be verified are the ghost stories themselves, but they've been recounted numerous times. They all, match up for generations. And then a lot of what we talk about are murders. We talk about different crimes, whether they be mafia-related, union-related. The one famous one is we go to the site of the Hotel Sterling, and in the newspapers in the 20s, this was when you still had an elevator boy that would send the elevator up and down. Well, the poor elevator boy, the door didn't quite close, and he went to try to close it. Well, unfortunately, his head got caught in the door, and then the elevator decided to go up, so he was unfortunately decapitated.
Oh, my word. Yeah.
And then the head actually jammed in the mechanisms of the elevator, and there was a several-hour delay in repairing it. And the newspaper reports of the day talk about how angry some of the richer patrons that were on the upper floors were at how long it would take to dislodge the poor young man's
Sounds
head.
like today.
Yes, it's not. Everything old is new.
Absolutely, everything old is new. And it's like people think it's a violent time now. It was just as violent back then, but you didn't have all the coverage and the immediate communication that you'd have now.
Sure. And that's the one I was going to ask about because it kind of stands out in my memory. And of course, with the building being gone now, it takes away a little of the ambiance. But nonetheless, supposedly, there was the ghost of that young man supposedly haunted the old Sterling Hotel.
He was still there in the elevator passageways. You could still hear his cries, according to many people over the years. Another interesting one, it's interesting because later on it comes full circle, is the old Miners Bank building was the union office for the Anthracite Mining Union. And the mob sort of crept into the Anthracite Mining Union. So you had 2 sections, the pro-worker side and the pro-mafia, pro-ownership side. So there actually was a shootout. A man named Frank Agati was actually killed The miners just walked in. They said, "Oh, we want to have a meeting with Mr. Agati." He came out, and they just shot him in his office.
Wow.
And it was basically something like out of The Godfather. They just dropped the gun, walked down Franklin Street. Well, that ended up leading to what was called the Good Friday Massacre, in which the mob retaliated with cigar boxes that were actually bombs. It actually was the Unabomber long before the Unabomber.
Yeah, that was a pretty famous story.
Well, the gentleman who they believed was responsible for it, a few people went to jail, but the man who they thought was the mastermind they could never prove. Fast forward to the 90s, a young couple buys an old Victorian home, and the Victorians love their wallpaper, so you have to peel layers and layers and layers and layers of wallpaper off. They get to the insides, and where the studs are is just loads and loads and loads of dynamite and blasting caps
Oh, my
packed
word.
into every single room of the house. So they had to call the ATF. They had to bring it all out. It was all still live. They had to detonate it all. And here it was the same man that owned the house was the same man that they believed was
responsible.
Pretty
for the-
interesting. You know, as a scientist and engineer myself, I don't believe anything in ghosts or spirits or all that. It's interesting to listen. That's just my
Right.
opinion, and there's a lot to it. But let me ask you a question.
Yes.
I've heard for many times that the reason that places are haunted and some aren't is because that the lives that were taken were gone prematurely. And that's the reason. If you had a more or less a controlled death and you were, up in age in your 90s or 100 or so when you died, well, it's a death. But because these lives were taken so violently, so suddenly, that they, the experts in
Right.
this field, the paranormal field, say that you have unfinished business on Earth, and that's why some of these places are haunted and some aren't. And it's a really interesting theory. You have to think about that.
Yeah, yeah.
It is interesting. I've heard that one before. We own both the Swetland Homestead and the Dennison House. We've had both of them looked at by experts. I generally am a skeptic as well when it comes to these things. And the thing with the Swetland Homestead is they were a little surprised that there was no activity there because a lot of the Swetlands did die young. They didn't die violently, but they died young. They died suddenly. And the way I looked at it, I said, well, the Swetlands were millionaires in the 1860s, so they could be anywhere they want.
That's
so I don't
right.
think they'll still be here. If they're going to haunt someplace, I don't think they're going to haunt
It's
here.
that same area, 44th, Wyoming, right at the
Yes.
border at the Dennison
Yes,
House. Same deal.
and while we're going to concentrate on Wilkes-Barre, I'm going to go back to Rusty for a second with his disclaimer on belief in, because you went to a site, and it was a railroad track, and the orbs of light that are saying. Tell us about it.
At the Corey Slope Breaker, it's a good one, Dave, in Old Forge back in 1971, a friend of mine went on a Saturday morning, a rainy, drizzly, dreary Saturday morning. Spielberg couldn't have created a better atmospheric picture. He was going to do a movie for this. And there was not only orbs of light that we saw, a friend of mine at this abandoned coal breaker in Old Forge. It has since burned down. In fact, it burned down 3 months after we were there. Pretty ironic. But it was the Old Forge Breaker, the Corey Slope Breaker, and we were there on a Saturday morning, and we looked into one of where they used to pull the coal cars in. There was a runway, a platform elevated, where you could look, where the people who filled the cars from the breaker could look and see at those days if the car was filled with coal. And you would have all your various chutes up there: buckwheat, barley, rice, pea coal, the different
Various types
sizes
of
of
coal,
coals
right.
as we would remember back then. We looked in because the platform to look for the railroad folks and the breaker folks to look in the railroad cars was about eye level back then. And we looked in, and there was a woman dressed in white terra cloth with orbs all around, flashes of light, standing on the railing, and from her knees down to this floor-length terra cloth, looked like a white, fluffy bathrobe, was all caked red clay mud. Now, is it a ghost? Well, we sure ran for a while after that, being in 1971, being about 12, 13 years old. The atmosphere was right, the timing was right, the place was right, but you have to think, what would a woman, and she wasn't a disfigured skeleton, not a horrible, awful, it was a young girl, probably in her mid to late 1920s, in a deserted area where you had to definitely be going there to go there, on a Saturday morning around 9 o'clock in the morning in Old Forge, Pennsylvania. What would somebody like that be doing? They're standing on the platform like this, looking directly at us, looking directly at her with the flashes of light. I swear that was just truly unbelievable. Was it a ghost, Dave? I don't think so. Boy,
Sometimes,
you know.
sometimes the setting is so important, which is why it is important to go on the ghost walk. We'll relate some of the stories, but when you see the buildings that are involved, it adds that other dimension to these stories. Even if you're just interested in the historical part of it.
Yes.
And I bring that up because I know City Hall is a stop. Well, let you explain about why that's important.
Well, City Hall is interesting because City Hall is built on the original Wilkes-Barre City Cemetery. At the time, believe it or not, that section of Market Street was actually the outskirts of town when Wilkes-Barre was first founded, so they had the cemetery there on the outskirts. Obviously, the town grew. It eventually became basically the commercial district that it is now. So they exhumed all of the bodies and sent them to the current Wilkes-Barre City Cemetery, which is next to Hollenbach by General Hospital there.
Right.
They thought they had exhumed all the bodies, but as they were constructing City Hall, they found a few more. And then when they were constructing police headquarters, they would find a few more. And
gee.
even as recently as 74, after the flood, Agnes flood, they did some renovations for police headquarters. They actually dug down. They have the ramp. If they bring a prisoner in, they drive behind it. And even in 1974, they were still unearthing caskets with remains in them.
I didn't realize
Yeah,
that.
that's unbelievable.
Yeah.
So that's pretty interesting. Of course, now it's something much scarier. It's, politicians meet there every day, so.
That's even more deadly. And as David mentioned too, you have the ambiance of the facades of the gargoyles
Yes.
back in those days.
Yes,
That's ironically so bizarre in itself.
It fits.
It does.
It fits. We also have pictures. We talk about it on the tour. We don't show the pictures though, but we actually have pictures when it was first completed. Some of the office workers would like to take their lunch on the spire on the very top, which is,
yes.
a good, 70, 80 feet off the ground
Sure.
at least. And they're just sitting there, eating their lunch, and they would, heckle the children as they would go by down the
That was big in the day, like we see the photos of
Yes.
them on the Empire State Building sitting on the girders with
Yeah.
their feet hanging 100 stories off.
Then you had the original courthouse on Public Square.
Yes.
And what was unique about that, and where that fits into the ghost stories, or the potential ghost stories, I guess, is the fact that executions used to be a public thing there.
Yes, they would send out very nice scripted invitations, calligraphy on them, nice material, and you would go and they'd be on Public Square and they would be walled off. And then enterprising people, because of course people live, there's still residential around a Public Square, but there was much more then.
Right.
People would actually charge a nickel or sometimes a dime, and you could get up on their roof and you'd be able to look over the wall and you'd be able to see the execution. Of course, then if you gentlemen were watching the execution, I would then go and take the ladder away, and you would have to throw me another nickel
To get the
in
ladder
order
down.
to get back down. And that actually became a fairly well-known scam that they would do during
Even
the
back
public-
then.
Yes.
Some young entrepreneurs.
Enterprising, I was going to say that.
Yeah, that's all. And of course, the executions then were by hanging.
Yes, they were by hanging. The last execution actually in Wilkes-Barre was a double feature. It was a double hanging. There was a Polish immigrant and a African-American jockey. And the Pole was a racist at the time, and he did not want to be hung by the same rope. They did the jockey first, and the Pole did not want to be hung by the same rope as an African-American. So the bailiff said, "Hey, no problem, we'll get it." And they went and got another rope, and they purposely cut about 2 feet off of it, so it was too short. So he fell and it snapped his neck.
Oh, my
and
word.
Boom, boom, boom. Because he said we wasted enough time.
Back then, when they pronounced you to death, they killed you. Not
Yes.
like today, where when they sentence you to death, you have at least 65 more years of,
Sure.
the-
No,
of the
it was
public
very
hearing.
efficient.
Absolutely.
That's true. That's true. And what's interesting is that all of those particular stories are all documented.
Yes, there's evidence of all of them. One of the main features that we cite many times during the tour is a book called Little Old Wilkes-Barre as I Knew It by Edith Brower. It actually was a speech she gave that they put in a book and published. And she recounts all of this. She went to a few of the hangings. Her father had to go and supervise because they had relatives that were buried in the old city cemetery, and they had to supervise the exhuming of their relatives to make sure they were transported properly. So she goes into some fairly interesting detail on a few of these things.
Now, some of the buildings that now make up Wilkes University
Yes.
figure prominently in the ghost tour. And here again, this is the ambiance thing where the buildings, and as you say, the gargoyles, the very design of those buildings, maybe it's because we've seen so many movies over the years where they use sets like that.
The turrets and the towers
Yeah.
and the peaks.
And these buildings are as they were built.
Correct.
So it really lends itself. Now, I don't know if your stories along that area of town are as well documented or not.
A few of them are. The interesting one is if you, right in the heart of the campus, the corner of Northampton and River there, that actually was where the town signpost was. And Charlie Miner writes about this in the History of Wilkes-Barre, or History of the Wyoming Valley.
Where the new glass dorm is on the corner.
Yes, right there. That was actually where the town signpost was. And the interesting thing about the town signpost, you'd go there and get the news. They would post the news and everything. But that also was where the stockade used to be.
Now, this was, back a bunch, this was sort of like a community bulletin board where they would post...
Yes, this was in the colonial era, the early turn of the 1800s.
All right.
So you'd have a
Like the
community
town
bulletin.
crier era
Yeah,
almost.
yeah, okay.
Exactly,
Yeah.
very similar.
And you'd go there and you'd read something that was going on in the community.
Correct.
Okay.
And then you would also be able to beat on whoever the thief or gossip or adulterer was that is locked up in the stockades that given week. Because part of it was supposed to be a community punishment. Everyone was supposed to help out and either throw things or spit on them or take a pot shot at them because of course they're locked up and you know.
Yeah,
you can't
so
get
the bad
anywhere.
guy was recognized.
Oh, yes.
And, yeah.
How about that?
So it was a little bit different time there when it comes to capital punishment.
Now, what kind of ghost stories come out of that area?
The interesting one is directly off of Northampton. If you go down maybe half a block towards Franklin, there is a large two-family home that's now a dorm. And it's been a dorm probably 40 years, 50 years now. And every class that goes in there, they tell the same apparition story. Every morning they can hear singing. And, you know, I dormed in college. You know, sometimes Sunday morning your head's hurt and you don't really want to get woke up first thing in the morning by singing. And every week on the dot, 9 o'clock, there's all this singing, and they think it's, you know, the RA's playing a trick on them because they're hungover or whatever, and they yell and scream. Well, here, you research back to it, on that site was a church. And they would have Sunday Mass, and they would have a celestial choir, and they had a large organ. So is the choir still practicing? I don't know.
I know
but
that dorm too, and I can't think of the name. It's on the right-hand side if you're going towards South Franklin Street.
Correct.
Yes, I
Yes.
know that. That's been a dorm. You're right. Since
Yes.
the '60s, it's been a dorm. One of the original Wilkes University,
Yes.
Wilkes College dorms.
And it was a place of worship before then.
How about
and-
that?
and-
That's interesting.
Excuse me. Well, the college scene is just ripe to take a ghost story and run with it.
Absolutely.
Although there have been instances, and I'm thinking of one at East Stroudsburg, where a particular dorm there had some phenomena. It was investigated, and there were definitely some unusual things that happened there. Whether the explanation ultimately could be proven to be natural or not, I don't know, because I don't know the end of that story. But you take something like that in a college atmosphere, and it adds to the
Absolutely.
to the depth of the story, if I may put it that way.
Yeah.
What kind of reaction are you getting from people who have been on the walk in years past?
We have some folks. I had a lady call and make reservations this week, and she said, "Oh, I was so worried that I wasn't going to make reservations." She goes, "This is my 12th year doing it."
Wow.
Which is just incredible. The tour changes slightly, but I mean, I would say a good 85-90% of it is roughly the same. So to have the repeat clientele is incredible. But I mean, people seem to enjoy it. You generally have the two groups. You have the people who are really into the paranormal, into the psychic, and then you have their friends that they drag along that are like you and I, that are just sort of like, okay, let's see what this is about. Mm-hmm. And usually by the end, the history part or some of the bad jokes Bill's written can usually win them over, and we try to go from there.
Well, and again, even if you're not into that ghostly part of it, the tour sort of makes you pay attention to some places and some architecture that are fantastic and that you might normally go by without really giving a second look.
You're right.
And there's even a few interesting things. If you go down on Public Square, you have the Bicentennial Building. The Bicentennial Building, for a long time after the flood, had a community room in it. And anybody could go and book it in town. It was just sort of open to the public. Well, one of the things that they used to do every week for a number of years in the late 70s and the early 80s was community seances.
Oh, I didn't realize
Wow.
that.
How
So
about that?
regardless of whether they were successful or not, it's kind of interesting. You go by there now and go, oh, that's okay. You know, it makes you think differently about
Didn't know that.
buildings that you walk by
And that
every
has
day.
since been renamed. It's not the Bicentennial,
Right.
but it was when it was next to the Burger Barn, which
Correct.
was the corner.
Yeah. Yes.
So we all go back to those days. Yeah, interesting.
Well, and I guess, you know, the research never stops. You keep finding out new things about your city and your community. And sometimes you're going to turn up things that are mysterious like this.
Yes, yes, and then you get interesting things. One of the earliest hangings in our area, we were talking about public executions earlier.
Right.
When General Sullivan came after the Battle of Wyoming to start his march up north to the Iroquois lands, they actually uncovered a Tory spy, and he was actually executed right about where the Market Street Bridge is now, right on the River Common. He was hung, he was given a military trial and executed the next morning at dawn. Very romantic, like in the movies. And so as far as we could tell, that may have been the first public execution in the area, and it was 1778. So.
Well, you go back to those stories and the Wyoming massacre, and the virtual. You saw the Indian tribes virtually wiped out after that.
Yes.
As Sullivan went up the river, so you wonder about some of those stories as well. But your ghost walk is centered in the downtown area. So again, it's a very about 2 miles, but very, very casual walk.
Yeah, there's no hills, very few steps. You're on sidewalks the entire time.
I'll bet in the future you could do a railroad version of that too for the Railroadiana fans, because don't forget, David, that was the hub for the Laura Line, the Lehigh Valley, and of course the central of New Jersey was the Market Street Square complex, which is still there.
Yeah.
Yes.
So there was a massive, not only passenger but also freight service in downtown Wilkes-Barre. So the railroads was an entire different, offshoot of that genre.
Yes. And we talk about it a little bit on our Swetland tour. William Swetland owned a number of railroads. He was a major investor in the Bloomsburg and Lackawanna, which started down in Bloomsburg, and then, as he put it, goes up to that town that they keep changing the name of, which ended up being Scranton, because of course it was Caboose and then Slocum's Hollow.
That's right.
And then, so yeah, there is quite a bit of railroad history here that it would be very interesting to put a tour together. It'd be a little bit longer, but I think there'd be a market there.
Right.
Now, you, like Rusty, are skeptical on these things. I have to admit I am as well, although I'm also very interested and I love a good story and I love a good scare when it's done
Absolutely.
the right way. So I have to ask you, when you've been on the tour, you ever get any twinge yourself in any of the particular places?
I don't know if you necessarily get a twinge. I mean, I think part of it is if you build the atmosphere up right, I think anything can give you, sort of a sense. So when you have a group of 45 to 65 people, and a lot of them do believe, and a lot of them, are very hyped up, and they're ready to go, and they're looking
Expecting
for something.
to
Right.
hear or see
It
something,
almost
yeah.
rubs off a little bit, and then you get one person, it's almost like a virus, well, what was that? Well, did you feel that? And the next thing it's spreading, and you get 3, you get 4, and then the whole group is ready to go.
Sure.
So I think there's definitely some of that, but I think it's more the atmosphere than anything else, because it is spooky. I mean, it's getting dark early now. You're downtown.
It's Halloween.
It's
time.
cold.
Yeah.
It's Halloween.
Yeah.
But Mark and Dave, I think the reason is I think that the genre out-promoted itself with a glut and a
Yes.
spate of all these ghost hunters, ghost finders, ghost
Yes.
adventures on
Yeah.
every cable channel in the universe, and I think that's what the deal is. I think this made a little bit more of a comical sense to it. Like, did you see that? Well, nobody saw it because they didn't have it on television. There wasn't
Right.
a camera at the time, and I think it's all the hype from that. I think that made our skepticism rise a little bit from the possibly believers to the definitely non-believers. Don't you agree with that?
I definitely agree with that, and I think you're seeing the rise now of horror as a genre again. I mean, when I was a kid, it was the tail end of the slasher movies. You had Jason, you had Freddy Krueger, and by the time, even I was old enough, it was sort of, they were long past, and it was more of a niche, and it was kind of a joke. But now you see the Paranormal Activity movies.
Absolutely.
The Halloween movies are back.
Absolutely.
They just redid Friday the 13th, so I definitely think the medium has changed.
And another Halloween is out in 2 more years
Yes,
now. Another
yes.
Halloween from 1978 when they're going to take it out in
Yes.
2018. So you're right.
But yet there is a big difference between when you're seeing a movie and then you're walking in downtown Wilkes-Barre where you can see a building that's
Right.
there from the 1800s that has that, if I may, ghostly look to it anyway.
Absolutely.
Now you couple that with a story that in many cases you can document that something happened in that particular area. You got to be thrilled with the way this thing is selling out.
Oh, we are tickled pink. That's why we probably would add more if we had the time. What happened was we had booked this weekend for the tours because next weekend we're going to do our haunted Halloween events, as we
That's
call it.
the other event now, right?
Yes.
Unless we're short on time, so two things. First of all, if they're interested in getting in on the Ghost Walk yet, what do they do?
Well, you can call us at the Society. It's 570 570-823-6244. You can make reservations there, or you can email us. Our email is actually right on our website. Our website's luzernhistory.org. Click the link. The email will go right to my phone, and I'll be the one that'll answer you.
Okay, now the second event,
The second event is actually going to be next Friday and Saturday. It's at both the Dennison House and the Sweatland Homestead.
these are the two original homes in,
Yes.
in Luzerne County.
They're both 215 plus years old, and they're new events this year. We rewrote the scripts for them. We rewrote the tours for them. At the Dennison House, it's going to be colonial superstitions, so 1780s, 1790s, the ghost stories and the superstitions and the things that the Revolutionary War soldiers believed, such as getting your palms read. You're going to hear a lot about the Battle of Wyoming and a lot of the superstitions that surrounded the massacre.
Okay.
And then if you go to the Sweatland home, we're actually doing Victorian death and mourning. Maggie Sweatland died in Philadelphia, but they actually shipped her body up, and her funeral was actually in the house. So we're going to recreate her funeral. We'll all be in first person. We'll be portraying the family, and then you'll learn about the many different customs and many different fears they had associated with the dead, because the Victorians were interesting about that.
Sure.
Keep those new dates coming, too. You know, P.T. Barnum never turned down a paying customer.
That's right.
No,
Right.
and you're talking about an era there where, heck, my favorite author, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who did
Yes.
Sherlock Holmes, was extremely into the paranormal and the afterlife. Matter of fact, he got into it pretty royally with Harry Houdini.
Yes.
Who would debunk a lot of things. Reservations for that one?
Reservations for that one are not required. Unlike the Ghost Walk, we're not going to cap it, but it's the same thing. You can pre-register. Same phone number, 570-823-6244. And you can either buy a joint ticket for both houses, which is $20, or you can buy one house or the other, which is $12. So
And of course, all these proceeds go to keep the Historical Society alive.
Correct. They go directly to the Historical Society, and the ones for the houses actually go back to the houses themselves, which
Upkeep, maintenance.
Sure.
because they wake up every day and eat money.
You
So
bet.
One final question, which I assume may have its own answer, but you've had to expand the walks this year. Any chance in the future you will have another major expansion?
most likely, if the demand is still there, I mean, we certainly can do that. You know, now that we know going in that we'll have this much demand, hopefully next year we could block 2 weekends off if we need them as opposed to one. But this year we have a new executive director, Dr. Newell. She wanted to get 2 weekends of events in, and it ended up, this is a good problem to have. So we're not too upset about it.
Absolutely. Congratulations. It's a good
Thank
tour.
you.
Again, I have
Yeah,
taken
good luck,
it.
Mark.
Thank you.
Mark Rossetti from the Luzerne County Historical Society. And of course, Rusty Fender.
Good to see you, David.
Good to see you, my friend. And Mark McGlory, thank you for
Mark.
keeping us in
Thanks, Mark.
focus. I'm David DeCosmo for ECTV Live. Until we see you again next week, here's hoping all your news is good.